Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're doing something a little different. We're diving into the Veritas Earth-based justice system. Now, this isn't a system you'll find in practice anywhere today. Think of it as, well, a visionary concept, almost a blueprint, maybe, for a completely reimagined approach to justice. One that truly steps outside our, traditional ideas of punishment and seeks something far more holistic and profound.
Exactly. And what makes Veritas so compelling and what our source material really unpacks in detail is how it pulls together principles from so many different fields. You've got neuroscience, restorative justice, trauma-informed care, ecological justice, even indigenous sovereignty. It's quite a mix. It's presented through these 6 foundational books, and each one kind of builds on the last. They really challenge our assumptions about what justice could be.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack these complex ideas, try to distill the most important insights, and explore how this system fundamentally redefines justice itself. What does it look like when justice isn't about vengeance, but about healing and balance? Okay, let's unpack this, starting with what Veritas calls the Book of Meaningful Thought. So this first book, it basically lays the groundwork. At its core, Veritas shifts justice away from retribution towards understanding and balance. It completely rejects our usual adversarial way of thinking, two sides battling it out to win. Instead, it pushes for something called fairness logic. That's a pretty radical shift, isn't it?
It truly is. The core insight here seems to be that you can't have balanced justice without complete truth. So Veritas relies on what it calls an unbroken memory archive. It's like a central system, the CVCM, Central Veritas Control Matrix, where all facts, testimonies, evidence is all meticulously recorded. Think of it like a collective incorruptible memory for the whole community. And there's a specialized function, JUNO, the memory keeper, who makes sure this truth is preserved, like a living archive almost. And this enables things like restorative truth-telling circles, which are deeply inspired by indigenous traditions, allowing everyone to safely share their perspectives.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by how Veritas embraces neuroethics and the science of mind. They actually use neuroscience, things like brain scans, not to replace human judgment, that's key, but to validate what they call invisible harms. Things like PTSD, chronic pain, or even the subtle impact of a mild traumatic brain injury. It's about recognizing that harm isn't just physical, right? And promoting rehabilitation by understanding the root causes. But my big question here is, how do they handle the ethics, privacy, with such sensitive data?
Yeah, that's crucial, and the sources emphasize it. They have strict neuroethical data use protocols that requires explicit informed consent for any neuroscientific data. The system also uses specialized thought agents. Think of them as internal checks, sometimes human, sometimes AI-assisted, like AGIOS, which does real-time bias audits on decisions, or LYRA, helping curate narratives so all perspectives are heard. Tempest deals with time aspects. They even have something called the mirror clause.
Mirror clause, what's that?
It requires these agents, these decision makers, to constantly reflect on their own biases, their own beliefs, and make sure their judgments align with community values. They log these reflections in doctrinal reflection entries, or DREs. It's about continuous improvement.
Okay, so it's not just rules on paper. It's about the people and the processes, keeping things principled. You mentioned a land use dilemma example in the source material. How would Veritas's fairness logic handle that differently than, say, our current courts?
Right, good question. So instead of like a developer versus environmentalist slugging it out legally, Veritas uses a fairness algorithm. And this isn't just code, it's a framework built on agreed-upon community values. It would weigh historical usage of land, the actual ecological impact, the communal needs of everyone involved. The key insight really is it's not about finding a single winner. It's about finding the most balanced, least harmful outcome that considers all stakeholders, including the environment itself. It moves from adversarial to, well, holistic problem solving.
That makes a lot more sense. Okay, so once Veritas transforms how we think about justice, the next challenge is transforming how we act in conflict. So let's move to the Book of Gentle De-escalation. This part seems focused on minimizing harm through, well, calm intervention. What does that actually look like day to day?
It's a lot about preempting tension and creating spaces for healing before things blow up. They implement what they call therapeutic communities, basically designated areas for community meditation gatherings, guided breathing techniques, that sort of thing, when conflicts start simmering. The foundational idea is to catch conflict early, at its least volatile stage.
And beneath that, it feels like Veritas really leans into trauma-informed care. The sources talk about collective grief and emotional healing after a conflict. Can you get into that a bit more?
Yes, and this is, I think, quite profound. Veritas recognizes that many disputes are actually rooted in unresolved trauma or grief. So after a conflict is addressed, they actually ritualize grief work. Imagine a designated healer, Thalia, in the system, guiding these processes, validating individual traumatic experiences as real and significant, regardless of its visibility.
Regardless of visibility, that's powerful.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that emotional wounds are just as valid as physical ones, and providing a structured way for communities to process loss, both collective and individual.
Which leads perfectly into non-coercive communication and empathy. The source material stresses mandatory training in nonviolent communication, or NVC, for everyone involved. How does that practically change the dialogue?
Oh, it's a complete reframe. Instead of accusatory language like, you destroyed my home, the system coaches people to express their needs and feelings. So a victim might be guided to say something like, I feel unsafe and angry because my home was taken. I need reassurance that my life will return to normal. And the person who caused the harm, they're encouraged to respond with empathy, like, I hear that you feel unsafe. I wish I could undo this.
Wow.
It's about breaking those cycles of blame and trying to foster understanding, even when things are really, really difficult. Agents like Orion, the Observer, and Vesta, for emotional support, coordinate this through the CVCM, focusing on servant leadership.
Okay, that sounds like it cultivates a very different dynamic. But what happens if de-escalation just isn't enough? What if someone simply refuses to engage with fairness logic, or NVC? That brings us to the book of gentle escalation. And here's where it gets really interesting. How can you gently escalate? That sounds like a contradiction.
It does seem like a paradox, doesn't it? But gentle escalation here is about applying nonviolent pressure to injustice. It's about increasing the moral weight, the moral pressure, without resorting to physical force. The system adapts principles from nonviolent campaigns. It outlines 3 basic stages. First, public awareness. That might involve, peaceful protests, petitions, sharing stories. Second stage, legal non-cooperation. Things like boycotts, or maybe withholding resources in a strategic way. And finally, the third stage is constructive action, where communities proactively implement solutions themselves, demonstrating alternatives to the injustice.
Okay, so it's not about dominance, it's about raising the stakes of inaction, maybe. Pipeline protest case study in the sources really brings this to life, I thought. Can you walk us through that one?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So imagine a rural community facing a pipeline proposal that threatens their land and water. Under Veritas, they might first try public awareness, sharing oral histories, concerns at town halls.
Yeah.
Standard stuff, maybe. If that doesn't work, they could escalate to legal non-cooperation. Maybe farmers withhold access to their land, making it difficult for the project. Finally, if the company just won't budge, the community might engage in constructive action. Perhaps they even build their own sustainable wetlands as a form of restitution, potentially funded by the company, showing how the land could be healed instead. Each step is about offering alternatives, you see, not just resistance.
Right, and I saw that Veritas even has protocols for urgency, boundary protocols, and urgent appeals. What's this imminent harm index they mentioned?
The IHI, yeah. The Imminent Harm Index is basically a sophisticated risk assessment tool. It can trigger gentle escalation leaps, essentially accelerating the process when there's a clear, immediate threat of significant harm. But it's still within the nonviolent framework. They also use symbolic rituals like a stake and cord ceremony to formally declare boundaries and intentions, makes the community's commitment tangible.
So even when things need to move fast, it's still handled with a principled approach.
Okay, and you mentioned procedural guardians earlier, like Aegis, Orion, LYRA. How do they function specifically during an escalation? Do they actually have veto power?
Yes, they absolutely do. These guardians, Aegis for bias, Orion for observation, LYRA checks rights frameworks, they conduct real-time audits. They monitor for any deviation from Veritas's core principles during the escalation. If a protocol is breached, any guardian has veto rights. That immediately pauses the process. And it requires a formal doctrinal reflection entry, that DRE, again, to reevaluate what went wrong. It's a built-in accountability mechanism. Wow, that's a powerful check and balance. Okay. Now, let's pivot a bit. From resolving conflict between parties to healing the individual. The Book of Mental Health and Grief Integrated Justice. This really shifts the focus profoundly to emotional and psychological well-being. It starts with this idea of emotional sovereignty. What does that actually mean for someone going through the justice system?
It's essentially the right to emotional autonomy, the right to refuse coercion based on your emotional vulnerability. So imagine a traumatized witness. Under Veritas, they could choose remote testimony, they could have support persons with them, they could even request specific accommodations like quiet rooms, maybe therapy dogs in the tribunal space. The insight here is that true justice can't happen if the process itself re-traumatizes people.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And this commitment to healing seems baked into the courts themselves. The sources talk about trauma-informed courts and healing tribunals. What kind of impact has that actually had in places that have tried similar things?
It's potentially transformative. Judges, staff, everyone, they're specifically trained to recognize and accommodate trauma symptoms, things like flashbacks or dissociation. And the sources cite some compelling data. Traditional core populations often have, like, twice the rate of trauma compared to the general public.
Wow, twice the rate.
Yeah. Ignoring that just leads to higher recidivism, right? But by adopting these trauma-informed practices, models like the Cook County Healing Courts apparently saw a significant 48% reduction in rearrests.
48%, that's huge.
It really illustrates how addressing trauma directly can actually break cycles of reoffending.
That's remarkable. And Veritas also seems to prioritize restorative mental health programs for offenders, too. How do they handle situations where someone's actions are clearly linked to mental illness or substance abuse?
Well, instead of automatically going to jail, nonviolent offenders with these kinds of underlying issues are often diverted into treatment programs. Studies mentioned in the source materials show this can lead to something like 45% lower recidivism in diversion participants.
Another big number.
Right. The system sort of understands that incarceration often just makes these issues worse, whereas treatment offers a path to genuine healing and change. The source even mentions programs using things like pottery workshops as part of the restorative process, making healing tangible.
And it sounds like Veritas embeds healing into rituals, too. What are some of these grief activation and therapeutic rituals they talk about?
Yeah, they're designed to help individuals actively process emotional pain, often communally. Things like art therapy rites, maybe sculpting symbols of grief, which have been linked apparently to about a 30% anxiety reduction, or echo grief ceremonies, which involve sort of looping narratives until the emotional intensity plateaus. Movement-based healing sessions shown to reduce PTSD symptoms by maybe 25%. The idea is that active communal engagement with grief can be incredibly therapeutic. They even mention toolkits using neurofeedback or AI counseling bots showing promise.
It's a very comprehensive approach to healing the individual. Okay, now let's broaden our perspective again. The Book of Transformative Restoration. This book really expands the scope of justice beyond just people, to the earth itself. It introduces ecology as stakeholder, and this concept of ecological personhood. What does it actually mean for a river or a forest to have legal standing?
This is a truly profound shift, I think. It means a river, a forest, an ecosystem can literally be represented in legal proceedings. It holds legal rights and potentially responsibilities, just like a person or a corporation might. The sources point to real-world examples, like Ecuador's constitutional court recognizing the rights of nature, or in New Zealand, the Wanganui River being granted legal personhood through a trust.
The Wanganui River, right.
It's about fundamentally acknowledging that the health of the environment is deeply intertwined with human well-being. Justice has to reflect that connection. They even mandate land acknowledgement protocols.
So, recognizing the earth as a living entity with rights. Okay. And this seems to lead naturally into structural injustice and systemic repair. How does Veritas approach fixing those deep-seated issues, like discriminatory laws or policies that harm both people and the environment?
Well, the idea is it's not enough to just punish individuals for harm caused by a broken system. Veritas actively allocates resources for systemic repair. They use tools like equity impact assessments, EIAs, to audit laws and policies for bias and disparate impact. For instance, the sources mention how some restorative justice initiatives, like the Chicago RJCCs, have helped rewrite zoning laws to reduce displacement in marginalized communities. The core insight is that justice must address the root causes of harm, not just the symptoms.
And this sounds like justice that actually evolves over time. I saw a really powerful example of time-reversible sanctions and restorative sentencing, specifically that Colombian deforestation reparation case study.
Yes, that case study is excellent. Instead of just fines or jail time for environmental damage, the offenders were tasked with actively replanting native species, funding local conservation cooperatives. And the system allowed these sentences, if you want to call them that, to adapt over time based on the actual ecological recovery observed. This approach apparently led to a documented 36% reduction in local deforestation rates in that specific region.
36%. Again, a concrete result.
It's a powerful example of justice that actively heals the land, not just punishes the person.
And another example mentioned was the Yurok Trab dam removal on the Klamath River. How does Veritas incorporate something like that?
That's seen as a prime example of community-led restoration projects.
Well,
The Yurok tribe co-managed the removal of dams, which then restored, I think it was 400 miles of salmon habitat,
Wow.
and it directly bolstered subsistence fishing for the community. Veritas would view this as a model. Justice is served when communities, especially indigenous ones, are empowered to lead the healing of their own lands and waters.
So what does this all mean at the end of the day? It means connecting the dots, right? Between human well-being and ecological health. And Veritas uses specific metrics to track this, doesn't it? Like a land healing quotient and a community resilience index.
Precisely. The LHQ, the land healing quotient, it actually measures things like biodiversity recovery, soil health. It's like a scientific report card for the land's repair.
Yeah.
And the CRI, the Community Resilience Index, tracks improvements in social cohesion, economic stability, well-being after restoration efforts. These aren't just abstract goals. Veritas uses concrete ways to measure if its restorative practices are actually working, proving their impact.
Okay. So finally, we arrive at the Book of Sovereignty. This is framed as the highest level of Veritas justice, defining sovereignty as collective empowerment. How does Veritas reimagine power itself? This sounds huge.
It's a radical departure, really, from our typical hierarchical power structures. Veritas operates on the principle of power as permission, meaning authority flows from collective recognition and consent, not from coercion or force. They draw inspiration from real-world models, like Switzerland's Landsgemeinde assemblies, those direct citizen voting gatherings, and also the Iroquois Great Law's rotating speaker system, which emphasizes shared leadership and mutual accountability. It's about distributed authority.
Distributed authority.
Yeah.
Okay, and this concept of sovereignty extends to ancestral rights and communal lineage. What does Veritas actually do to address historical injustices tied to land or identity?
This is where things like genealogical archives come in, maintained by agents like LYRA. They meticulously document family histories, lineage, connections to land, and this facilitates land repatriation protocols. It's similar in spirit, maybe, to New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi settlements. Descendants of displaced peoples can petition for the restoration of sacred sites, ancestral lands. It's about trying to rectify historical wrongs and honor those deep, long-standing connections to place.
And this commitment to self-determination must mean prioritizing cultural sovereignty and indigenous law, right?
Absolutely. Critically, there's a mandatory free prior informed consent protocol, FPIC, for all cultural matters. That aligns with international standards like UNDIIP.
Okay, FPIC.
Yeah. It means no external policy can just override a community's will regarding its own cultural heritage. Furthermore, Veritas integrates customary law. It allows individuals in some cases to choose their own justice form, similar to the Sami Court of Justice model in Scandinavia, which respects indigenous legal traditions alongside state law.
And they even apply this idea of shared sovereignty to the environment itself. With ecological sovereignty and land codetermination, what are bioregional councils?
Bioregional councils, yeah, these are fascinating. They bring together both human representatives and what they call ecological proxies. These proxies are individuals or groups specifically tasked with representing the non-human elements of a region, like a specific river basin or forest or watershed, and they share decision-making power with the human reps, ensuring that land health, informed by things like biodiversity metrics, is central to every governance decision.
It's literally giving nature a seat at the table.
Pretty much, yeah.
And looking even further ahead, the source material touches on digital sovereignty and data personhood. How does this apply in our increasingly data-driven world?
It's definitely forward-thinking. It's the idea that individuals can assign guardians for their digital profiles, treating their digital footprint as an extension of their personal sovereignty. They're even apparently piloting AI sovereignty agents to explore autonomy rights within purely digital realms. It's all about ensuring that as technology races ahead, the core principles of self-determination and permission remain central. They track this with metrics like a sovereignty score and an ancestral anchoring quotient.
Wow, what a journey we've just taken through the Veritas Earth-based justice system, seeing how it really tries to intertwine ancient wisdom, modern science, and just a profound respect for all life. It's such a radical departure from what we know.
Indeed. I mean, this system truly reimagines justice, not as some kind of punitive endpoint, but as this ongoing process, a process of healing, finding balance, fostering collective well-being. It's really about nurturing understanding, addressing root causes, and empowering communities to create their own solutions.
So imagine a justice system where the health of the land, the healing of trauma, and yeah, the echoes of our ancestors are just as central as the verdict itself. What would it take for our own communities to even begin to embrace such a profoundly transformative vision? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.